The Young and the Restless Spoilers shock. Claire's return to Los Angeles was supposed to be the start of something beautiful, a declaration of love that would finally free her from the shadows of her past mistakes. She had convinced herself that this city, with all its bright lights and silent betrayals, could somehow offer redemption. She wanted to believe that her love for Holden was different, that this was not another temporary distraction or reckless infatuation, but something deep and genuine that could survive scrutiny. Yet as soon as she arrived, she could feel the tension building like a storm that had been waiting for her. The glances from old friends, the unspoken questions, the invisible boundaries between her and Kyle, all of it reminded her that nothing was ever truly over in Los Angeles. The air carried memories, and the people here never forgot. She tried to ignore the way her heart tightened every time Kyle's name came up, how guilt crept into her chest like cold wine through a cracked window. Their so-called breakup had been more of an unfinished argument than a true ending. Kyle's voice still lingered in her head, his words cutting through her late-night attempts to convince herself she was doing the right thing. She had chosen Holden because he made her feel alive again, because he understood the pain of being trapped between who you are and who you're expected to be. But soon, she would realize that her decision came with consequences that went far beyond heartbreak. The first few days back were deceptively calm. Holden seemed distant, distracted, but she told herself it was just the stress of his new project, or the weight of being in the same city where everything could collapse at any moment. He reassured her that what they had was real, that it was worth fighting for, but even his words felt rehearsed, like lines from a script written to keep her quiet. Claire's instincts had always been sharp, and though she tried to silence the voice inside her warning her to look closer, it grew louder with each passing day. She began to notice small things, the late-night calls he dismissed as work-related, the unfamiliar perfume on his clothes, the way his expression changed when her phone lit up with Kyle's name. Every detail gnawed at her. She wanted to trust Holden, but she also knew that in Los Angeles, secrets were the currency people used to survive. Then came the whispers. She overheard a conversation she wasn't meant to hear, fragments of a name spoken in hushed tones, Sienna. The name alone was enough to send a chill down her spine. Claire had met Sienna once at a private event months ago, an encounter brief but unsettling. Sienna had that kind of presence that made everyone nervous, a woman who always knew more than she should, who could turn charm into manipulation without breaking a smile. The idea that Holden might be involved with her felt impossible at first, too cruel to be true, but the more Claire tried to dismiss it, the more it haunted her. She began following the patterns, retracing Holden's steps, noticing where his stories didn't align. Her nights turned restless, her thoughts consumed by suspicion. She became someone she didn't recognize, calculating, quiet, observant. The woman who once believed in love now studied it like evidence at a crime scene. The turning point came on a stormy night that seemed to echo her emotions. Rain pounded against the city like a relentless confession, and the streets glistened under the reflection of distant lights. Holden had left the house late, saying he needed to meet a colleague about an urgent matter. Claire had pretended to be asleep, waiting until the sound of his car disappeared before slipping on her coat. Something in his voice, the way he avoided her eyes, told her this wasn't just business. She followed him through the wet streets, her heart racing as if trying to warn her of the truth she didn't want to see. Every turn he made, every stoplight he paused at, only deepened her dread. When he finally parked near an unfamiliar building at the edge of the city, she kept her distance but stayed close enough to see everything. What she witnessed would change her forever. Through the rain-soaked windshield, she saw Holden step out of the car and approach a figure standing under a flickering streetlight. The moment the woman turned, Claire's breath caught in her throat. It was Sienna, elegant, composed, and devastatingly familiar. They exchanged a few words she couldn't hear, but the body language said everything. Then, in a movement so intimate it made Claire's stomach twist, Holden reached for Sienna and pulled her close. The kiss was not one of confusion or weakness, it was deliberate, passionate, and cruelly honest. Claire's hands trembled on the steering wheel, tears blending with the raindrops on the glass as her world began to collapse in silence. She had betrayed Kyle, walked away from stability and loyalty, for a man who had been betraying her all along. It was almost poetic in its cruelty, the cycle of deception continuing without mercy. She wanted to scream, to run up to them, to demand an explanation that could make sense of this betrayal, but she couldn't move. She was paralyzed, watching the man she thought she loved lose himself in someone else's arms. And then, as if to deepen the wound, she saw them disappear together inside the building. The implication was undeniable. She knew what was happening behind those walls, knew it in the way her chest burned and her throat tightened until she could barely breathe. That moment, under the rain, was when love finally died for Claire, not in anger, but in resignation. The realization that she had given everything to someone who treated her heart as disposable hollowed her out in a way that no apology could ever repair. For hours, she sat there, unable to drive away. The storm grew heavier, the city seemed to mourn with her, and the windshield wipers kept up a mechanical rhythm against the sound of her breaking heart. Her mind replayed every memory, every promise Holden had made, every touch that now felt contaminated by lies. She remembered the way he had looked at her just that morning, saying he loved her, and wondered how many times he had practiced that expression before using it on Sienna. The irony cut deep. Claire had always thought she understood betrayal, having been both the victim and the perpetrator in her complicated history with Kyle. But this was different. This wasn't just heartbreak, it was humiliation. It was the realization that she had abandoned someone who truly cared for her, all for a fantasy built on deception. In the days that followed, Claire withdrew from everyone. She stopped answering calls, stopped showing up at events, stopped pretending that she was fine. Her silence spoke louder than any confrontation could. Holden tried to reach her, leaving messages filled with excuses and apologies, but she couldn't bring herself to listen. Every time she saw his name, it reminded her of that kiss under the rain, of the way he had made her feel small without even realizing it. She deleted every trace of him from her life, the photos, the texts, the little reminders of the future they were supposed to build. But erasing him from her heart would prove far more difficult. She still woke up some nights hearing his voice, still caught herself wondering if there was any truth left in their story. It was a form of torture, loving someone who had already moved on. Kyle, meanwhile, remained an unspoken presence in her mind. He had always been the one who saw through her defenses, the one who warned her about chasing illusions. Claire couldn't help but think of him now, wondering if he knew what had happened, if he pitied her or still hated her. Maybe both. She didn't blame him. She had broken something between them that could never be repaired, and now she understood what it felt like to be on the other side of betrayal. In a strange way, she found herself craving the stability she once took for granted. The irony of her situation was unbearable. She had left a man who loved her for one who never would, and in the process, she had lost herself. But Los Angeles had a way of forcing people to keep moving, no matter how shattered they were. Claire eventually began to rebuild, not because she forgave Holden, but because she refused to let his betrayal define her. She turned her pain into strength, her heartbreak into clarity. She stopped looking for love in the wreckage of her mistakes and started facing the person she had become. The city that had once been a stage for her emotional chaos now became her mirror, reflecting both her scars and her resilience. Yet deep down, she knew that what she had witnessed that night would never truly leave her. It would remain a silent memory, a scar that reminded her of the dangers of trusting too deeply in a world where loyalty was a myth. As for Holden and Sienna, their connection would burn fast and dangerously, built on the same deceit that destroyed Claire. What began as desire would soon unravel into manipulation and control, proving that betrayal never leads to peace, it only breeds more chaos. And somewhere in the midst of it all, Claire would find herself caught again in the web of consequences, because in Genoa City and Los Angeles alike, no secret ever stays buried for long. The story was far from over, it was only beginning to shift into a darker, more unpredictable chapter. One where love and revenge would once again collide, and Claire would be forced to decide whether she wanted justice, closure, or simply to forget. The rain had barely stopped when Claire's trembling hands pushed open the car door. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to turn back, to drive away before she did something she couldn't undo, but rage had already taken control. The sight of Holden's car parked outside the small apartment building was more than she could bear. Her chest tightened with every step she took, and her wet hair clung to her face as if the storm itself was trying to restrain her. The building's narrow hallway smelled of dust and perfume, and when she reached the half-open door, she could hear their laughter, low and intimate. That sound shattered whatever restraint she had left. She stormed into the room, her eyes burning with betrayal. The shock on Holden's face was instant, his expression collapsing into panic, while Sienna froze mid-motion, her dress falling loosely from her shoulders. Claire's voice broke through the room like a thunderclap, shaking with fury and disbelief. She didn't need to think about the words, they came from a place deeper than logic, from pain that had been waiting too long to be heard. Holden's attempt to approach her only fueled her anger. She could barely see straight, all she saw was the image of him pressing his lips against another woman's. His excuses came tumbling out too quickly, too practiced, as if he had rehearsed them in anticipation of being caught. He reached out to touch her, to hold her hand, to calm her down, but she pulled away, disgusted. The phrase he muttered, "Please, it's not what you think," was almost laughable. How many times had that line been used to cover betrayal? Claire's chest heaved as she glared at him, tears mixing with rain on her cheeks. "Not what I think," she wanted to scream. Everything about the scene contradicted his words. The disheveled sheets, the lingering scent of wine and perfume, the half-finished glasses on the nightstand. Every detail mocked her faith in him. And then her gaze turned to Sienna. The woman stood silently, her chin slightly raised, as if daring Claire to make the next move. There was no guilt in her eyes, no shame, only a cold, knowing smirk that twisted something inside Claire. That single look was enough to make her snap. The sound of the slap echoed through the apartment, sharp and raw. It wasn't just an act of rage, it was years of humiliation, disappointment, and misplaced trust released in one strike. Sienna stumbled backward, momentarily stunned, but she recovered quickly. Her hand rose to her cheek, and before Holden could intervene, she lunged at Claire. What followed was chaos, two women tangled in fury and heartbreak, the room erupting into a storm of broken glass and shouting. Holden rushed between them, grabbing Claire's arm as she tried to push Sienna away again. The struggle was messy and desperate, a physical manifestation of every lie, every deceit that had poisoned their relationships. Holden shouted for them to stop, his voice cracking under the strain, but neither woman listened. Sienna's perfume filled the air, suffocating, cloying, a cruel reminder of what had brought them there. When Holden finally forced himself between them, his face was red with anger and panic. He turned to Sienna, his tone sharp now, ordering her to leave. She hesitated for a moment, glaring at Claire as if to say this wasn't over, then snatched her coat and stormed out into the rain. The sound of the door slamming behind her left an eerie silence in the room. Claire stood there, shaking, her hands clenched into fists, her breathing shallow. Holden's voice softened as he tried to explain, but she couldn't hear him anymore. It was as if something inside her had shut down. His words, apologies, justifications, half-truths, blurred into meaningless noise. She stared at him, seeing not the man she loved but the stranger he had become. Every lie he had ever told now seemed visible on his face. He reached out again, desperate to hold her, to salvage what little was left, but she stepped back. Her eyes were empty now, the fire replaced by cold clarity. "You let me believe in you," she whispered inside her head, though the words never left her lips. "And you destroyed everything I had left." Holden followed her as she turned toward the door, his voice breaking as he begged her not to leave like this, insisting it was all a misunderstanding, that Sienna had manipulated him, that he never meant for things to go that far. But Claire knew better. She had seen the way he looked at Sienna, the hunger, the ease. It wasn't manipulation. It was desire. And that was worse than any calculated betrayal. Because it meant that a part of him had wanted it. She walked out without looking back, the rain drenching her again as if the universe was washing away the last of her illusions. The city lights blurred behind her tears, and the echo of Holden's voice faded into the storm. The days after the confrontation were a haze of exhaustion and denial. Holden called endlessly, sent messages, appeared at her doorstep more than once, but Claire refused to answer. Each knock on the door felt like an insult, a reminder of how easily she had been deceived. Her reflection in the mirror frightened her, pale, hollow-eyed, a woman unrecognizable from the one who had once believed in second chances. She tried to throw herself into work, into routine, but every object in her apartment seemed to carry his memory. The sweater he had left behind. The framed photo she hadn't yet removed. The ghost of his laughter in the kitchen. It was everywhere, suffocating her, until she finally packed everything that reminded her of him into a box and left it on the sidewalk, like trash that needed to be taken away. Meanwhile, Holden sank into his own spiral. Sienna, too proud to admit defeat, began spreading her own version of the story, claiming Claire had been unstable, that she had imagined the affair, that Holden was the real victim. But the truth had a way of resurfacing in this city, and soon enough, people began to see through the performance. Holden's guilt grew heavier each day. He knew he had lost Claire, but what stung most was realizing how easily he had thrown her trust away. What had been a moment of weakness had turned into a lifetime of regret. He tried to reach out one final time, standing outside her apartment one evening, but when Claire finally opened the door, her eyes told him everything. There was no anger left, only indifference. That was how she ended things, with silence, the kind that hurts more than any words could. The breakup was inevitable. There was no reconciliation, no lingering hope that they might find their way back to each other. What existed now was only distance, a chasm carved by betrayal. Claire began to rebuild herself piece by piece, rediscovering the parts of her identity that had been buried under dependence and longing. She learned to breathe again, to find peace in solitude. But beneath that calm exterior, a scar remained. It wasn't just heartbreak, it was the understanding that love, when built on lies, could become as destructive as any enemy. As for Holden, he tried to move on, but the guilt stayed with him, a constant shadow in his waking thoughts. Sienna drifted out of his life as quickly as she had entered it, leaving only ruin in her wake. Whatever passion they shared turned bitter, poisoned by what it had cost them both. And though Holden occasionally caught himself wondering if Claire would ever forgive him, deep down he knew she never would, and that she shouldn't. Because forgiveness, for her, would mean forgetting the night she found out who he truly was. In the quiet that followed, Claire learned something vital. Sometimes the most painful endings are also the most necessary. Love doesn't always die in betrayal, sometimes it transforms into clarity. The night she slapped Sienna wasn't just about rage, it was the moment she reclaimed herself from the web of deception. Holden's mask had fallen, and for the first time in a long time, Claire saw reality with brutal honesty. She walked away not as a victim, but as someone finally free from illusion. And though the memory of that stormy night would never fade, it no longer defined her. It became a lesson, one that taught her that strength is born not from the absence of pain, but from surviving it. And somewhere, deep down, she knew that life would find a way to test her again. In Los Angeles, heartbreak was never the end, it was only the beginning of another story waiting to unfold.